Julia's a therapist in private practice. She is the Vice President at the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy. She's a former paediatric counsellor at St Mary's in London, and founder patron of the Child Bereavement UK charity. So a huge amount of experience, as well as 2 books, Grief Works and This Too Shall Pass, 2 amazing books. In fact, let me just promote one of them. Well worth getting hold of, a lot of wisdom in there. Julia, thank you so much for being willing to come and talk to me.
It's a pleasure. It's something I really, really believe in, so I'm delighted to be talking to you.
One of the things that
whose face I can't see, I wish I could see your faces, but I'm glad you've joined us, and I hope
it's a curious experience, isn't it? Being watched by, I don't know, 70, 80 people, but not able to sort of see how they're reacting, responding to the things that we're talking about. Actually, just on that, because of this period, tell me your take, your view of what's been happening in these last 3 months. How do you see what's been happening?
Gosh, I mean, that's an enormous question. I mean, I did some work with St Mary's, so I supported a paediatric team who were on the ICU, who then took on adult patients. So I did some staff support twice a week, from 1 to 2, during the crisis for about 2 months. And so from a sort of doctors and health professionals perspective, I saw firsthand the intensity of the demand. So first of all, having to work in a way that they'd never worked before, having to upskill to work with adults, to then not know what to expect. It was like sort of waiting for, you know, a gun to fire for the battle to start, kind of thing. And then during the crisis, when there were so many patients, it was incredibly intense. And there were far more deaths than they'd ever witnessed before. You know, they were paediatric intensivists, not adult intensivists. At St Mary's, we normally, I can't remember what the numbers were exactly, but they probably had about 25 deaths a year. And there were far more COVID deaths in that very short time. So the kind of psychological hit that everybody took, you know, all the nursing staff, the paediatricians, and all the other people that came in, was enormous. But the thing that got them through was the team. At the beginning, when we were talking about it, they said they needed to stay in a team, and not because they could have been split off into the other ICU at St Mary's. And they decided to work as a team. And so there was already so much trust, which they needed, you know, whereas everyone who's listening who did it, or some of them, you know, working with PPE, you have very little visual contact. It's so hard to communicate. So knowing each other makes an enormous difference, knowing who each other is and knowing how each other works. And I mean, the thing that got them through was their grit, the fact that they felt, I think in some way grateful that they were working and doing what they trained to do, and that it felt like this is what they were primed to do, and that felt like an incredibly powerful thing. Their dark black humor, you know, really got them through. But it was incredibly demanding. Lots of the things that normally happen were just intensified. It was like, you know, normal stress, but with the volume turned up much, much higher.
Mm. So to just break it down a little bit. So you were there from in the preparation, in the sort of pre-surge.
Before patients came in.
And so what was that period like? What was sort of what were people focused on?
Well, I can't really sort of talk too in detail, but it was really how they were going to operate and how they were going to manage themselves and how they were going to and you were helping facilitate the communication between people in terms of. I was giving them psychological support, but on an iPhone.
Yeah.
So I mean, it was confidential what we did, but I'm just talking in general terms.
Yeah. Yes.
It was, so asking me about COVID, that was incredibly intense. But also, I think a lot of them felt proud of what they'd done and that they did an amazing job. They did save lives. And, the purpose and meaning of being a doctor was very powerful and very strong.
I mean, one of the things that you've talked about in the book, I mean, is about communication. Sort of, what are some of the things about trust, about ways in which people can feel the sort of loving connection with each other? And how was that cultivated in the team? Was it just sort of sharing about the fears and anxieties, the worries?
I don't want to focus too much on what happened in that particular team. I can see why you wanted to ask me, but it was confidential.
Yeah.
But what I can say about communicating in hospitals generally is that the thing that, and is true for relationships, the thing that predicts good outcomes is that you are able to communicate openly and honestly and kind of say what is going on, but also that you repair after a disagreement. And most difficulties come from when you have a small fight over who takes out the bins, or a big fight over someone working too much, and they're not doing enough. They're not really pulling their load in at home, and finding a way of repairing after you've had a fight, and where the relationship feels stronger. And I think that's true in hospital systems as it is in people's private lives. That there are lots of stresses and difficulties and complexities that come up, and the more people can find a way of navigating their way to understand each other and build bridges between differences, then you have trust.
I mean, one of the constant themes in this sort of series of conversations is about resilience in the face of difficult, challenging sort of situations, environments. What are some of the things that you would sort of feel would be important to sort of include in terms of finding resilience in the face of these sort of difficult, traumatic situations?
I mean, there are two sides of it, I think, from a medical perspective. Is first of all, the culture within the NHS. It is improved from a mental health perspective, but there is still a stigma around asking help, looking for support. There is still a kind of culture of you're a failure if you don't just keep pushing on and working harder, and it's very much the sort of old Florence Nightingale kind of attitude. You kill yourself in order to, save others. And the stats in the NHS are not good. So this NHS sickness and absence rates are double the national average. Their suicide rates for junior doctors as well as long-term doctors are much higher than the national average, as are their addiction and their separation and divorce rates. So I think part of it is the culture of recognizing the system that they work in, that they need to recognize that they have to put in place systems that support their staff, that make it a normal part of functioning is that they get psychological support, because it's an unbelievably stressful job in many different ways. If I make a mistake, I'm upset and annoyed. If they can make a mistake and someone can die. So the stakes are extremely high. From a personal perspective, I think, first of all, doctors have to make the decision that it is part of being professional to support themselves, that they need to build their own resilience, given that the environment is still not that friendly from a psychological perspective. They have to make the decision before they do anything that I need to kind of take this seriously, because if I'm going to work effectively and long term, I need to keep my physical health and my mental health, which are completely intertwined, kind of alive and strong. And the basics are not rocket science. The basics are that you take regular exercise, because that's the equivalent of a low dose of antidepressants, that you have more awareness of what's going on inside you. And I think for doctors, kind of ways of having peers to talk to and debrief with after particularly difficult events, that you choose to do things that console you and comfort you, because you know a lot of being a doctor is being on alert, being on demand, kind of being on high octane, and so finding ways to replenish that and restore that by by doing things that don't require that, you know, listening to music, going for walks, doing your garden, doing things that completely wind your system down. So you build resilience. Our systems don't mind stress, but you build resilience when you allow for both. So you go up and then you go home and you choose things that wind your system down. I think hugs are, you know, build resilience, connection to others. If you look at all the research from the 75-year Harvard study and all the different researches, really globally, the single factor that predicts happiness and people who, sorry, I'm saying it the wrong way around. People who have good, strong relationships are healthier, wealthier, happier, live longer, have less pain in old age and better memories in old age. So the elixir to life is good, strong relationships.
And a hug.
And hug. Sex and love and rock and roll. But I think one of the most difficult things that, you know, I was at St Mary's 25 years supporting the staff, and the thing that is so difficult, and I think it's true for GPs and not necessarily just people who work in hospitals, is the trying to get a balance between work and home. That you put enough, you know, that you don't take your best self to work and your shit self home. That you, because, you know, work is very addictive. You know, saving people's lives really does the business, or doing good, although a lot of it is really difficult and demanding, and but it's all consuming, but going home can feel quite kind of flat, I think. So you have to create habits for yourself that do the transition between work and home, that wind your system down. So I give people meditations, breathing exercises, relaxations, all things that take 3 or 4 minutes, so that they kind of literally shut the door on, have a boundary between work and home, shut the door on work, to enable them to transition, to go into home, and then engage with their life there.
Do you think it attracts a certain kind of person?
Well, if you look at the research, I mean, quite a lot of it is families. So, you know, doctors are children of doctors, or they've been told they have to be a doctor, you know, by their families. But neither of those are kind of, I'm not saying they're wrong, but quite a lot of them, if you look at the stories and the research, it's walking wounded, that people who had something happen to them in their childhood, they may have had a sick parent or a sibling, or some event shaped them that then influenced them to go into the business of making people better.
And does that make people a certain sort of vulnerability because of that sort of history?
Well, I'm one of those people, you're one of those people, we're in the helping professions.
Yeah.
It's incredibly seductive being able to help. It's incredibly difficult to say no. And because it makes you feel good. And again, the research shows altruism is, you know, I mean, one of the things to make you feel better, which I didn't say for resilience, is helping others. You know, one of the counters to depression is altruism, is going out to help others. But this box is ticked by everyone who's a doctor, because you do feel better by helping other people. So it really works. But it then, it's incredible. Like I said, I'm repeating myself. It's very seductive.
I mean, you know, the first point you said about the culture. Do you think that's a culture that stands outside of the general culture, that's very specific to the medical world, or is it a combination of different things?
I think that's interesting. I mean, I think, you know, the awareness of the importance of mental health and the lack of stigma has really changed even in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
And I think it is improving in the NHS, but you know, it's a big old ship, the NHS. It takes a lot to turn it around and to shift and move things.
Mm.
And what I hope is that the young generation will bring the change, that they will do more debriefing. Debriefing makes a big difference. The thing of Schwartz rounds makes a big difference. Having colleagues that you can be honest with and talk to, all of that makes a big difference. So if they create an environment that is more psychologically supportive, I think that will make it, you know, will improve things. I think the other thing, just to link back to what I was saying about altruism and walking wounded, helping other people, is everybody within the NHS has to learn a decent no, so that you'll know, you know, that what's your yes worth if you never say no. If you're the person in your team who always says yes to work the extra hours to fill in when someone's sick, to stay on, you will be the one that is always asked to do it. And within that team, it's incredibly difficult to say no. But you need to kind of find a way of really holding on to your no. And that's how you build a boundary between work and home that enables you to have a stronger work life, which then enables you to have a more satisfying and stronger home life.
I mean, because you're at St. Mary's for, did you say 25 years?
Yeah.
I mean, are there tangible things that you see have changed structurally in attending to mental, emotional well-being?
Since I first started?
Yes.
So I left 5 years ago, and I think it's improving. I think it's improved, and there's more awareness since I left. When I started, there was no discussion of psychological support for staff.
Mm.
And it was very much kind of grit and get on and don't be pathetic, keep going, fight on, all of that kind of language. I mean, it did change over the time, and you know, debriefing, which I think is key, became more habitual, happened more and more.
Just say a bit more about debriefing for people who might not know.
The model that I use for it, if you want to jot it down, is the Gibbs reflection model.
Yeah.
And you can have a hot debrief, which happens immediately. So I was always involved if a child died or a baby died, and if there was a particularly difficult death. So that's the area that I worked in. And so you could have a hot debrief where, as a team, you each talk about what your experience is, what you saw, what you did, what you learned from it, and what you're kind of taking with you. That's the cycle of the talk. And you can do that very briefly and quickly over a cup of tea when the round is ending, when your shift ends. And then we would have a longer debrief, normally over a lunch hour, a day or 2 days later. And a lot of people would come to that. And that built a culture that it was okay. It did two things. One is that you saw that other people felt the same as you did. Because when a child dies or when a patient dies, you know, a death out of time, an unexpected death, the first thing any medic says is, what did I do wrong? What did I miss? Where did I fail? And that terrible kind of wheeling and ruminating and coming in a room together where you see other people have the same feelings, but also you get more pieces of the jigsaw so that you see that actually something else happened that you didn't even know about. And people feel differently, and it takes like half an hour, 40 minutes. It's not rocket science, it's not complicated.
And that's part of the structure now. That's ingrained in the structure.
As far as I know, I mean, yeah.
I mean, if you were in charge, Well, how would you
I would
do?
hate to run a hospital. Oh my goodness.
Well, forget that bit. But if you could do anything to kind of push it to the next sort of level, what would be the primary things you would want to put into the culture?
I think when you're training medics, you have to put in psychological well-being and mental health for yourself. I think you have to put in how to build your own resilience, how to support yourself. And I think you have to put in the training. I did quite a bit of sort of communication training about breaking bad news, telling a family a baby or a child had died. And that was an hour, and that was often the only training they had at all their entire career. And if you think that's the most difficult thing, you could do probably professionally.
1 hour. 1 hour of training.
I had 1 hour in a lecture theatre with 70 medical students. And I think there should be more communication training. Because that, building trust with your patients so that they can fully hear what you're saying, you have to build trust in yourself first. You have to kind of trust that you have to have confidence about how you speak and what you say. A lot of communication is about, it's not just the words, it's about how you look, it's the tone of your voice, it's the level of your voice, it's the speed of when you speak and the cadence. And when people are upset and distressed, often they speak very, very fast. And then the meaning of what they say doesn't land. So if you want to kind of really land a very difficult message, you have to speak really slowly. You have to get the patient to reflect back to you what they've understood. You have to kind of go with them on quite a slow, not a very long or complicated, but quite a kind of clear process, so that by the time that patient leaves the room, that they have the same information as you. Most of the complaints of doctors isn't that the doctors didn't give the right information, it's that the patient didn't feel they'd heard it.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I suppose that also means the doctor has to be sort of congruent and sort of grounded in their own sort of, in a way, there's more risk, presumably, that you're.
And I think everybody has it, but you just don't trust that you have it. You don't believe that you have it. So you need the training to give yourself the confidence that you can do this. Like our training.
I mean, in the book, in This Too Shall Pass, you talk about the 8 pillars of strength. I mean, it's sort of in time of change, but it just seems so appropriate, just generally. Could you sort of, I mean, I know you've sort of touched on some of them in the last 20 minutes or so, but they seem so sort of giving such sort of clarity. They're quite concise. Can you just say a little bit about?
So, and anyone can go and find them on my website if they want to kind of look for them for themselves. So it's a way to build resilience. And when you're in a time of change, your pain is the agent of change, the discomfort of change. And when we're kind of a bit scared and not knowing, what our new job is going to be, or right now not knowing the future at all, lots of economic distress, we tend to kind of freeze or ruminate, fight or flight or freeze.
Yeah.
And so I developed the pillars of strength as a kind of internal habits, attitudes, and ways of being that if you do them, they really help hold the kind of pillars to be robust when the winds of change, because it often feels like a wave, come and throw you off kilter, like the world has been thrown off kilter now. And so it's all of it's kind of evidence-based. So it's basically being in relationship with yourself, that you know yourself, you know what your triggers are. And
that's the first one. Yeah.
And that you're self-compassionate. So you don't have what I call in the book shitty committee. You don't have this voice that's constantly berating you.
Well, what do you call it again? Shitty what?
Shitty committee. so that you speak to yourself as compassionately as you would a friend. So you're kind to yourself. You're not saying you bloody idiot, you fool, you've done it wrong. You kind of say, okay, calm down, this has gone wrong, take a breath. The relationship with the others is the single most important thing in our lives and our outcomes and our happiness and our well-being, so that we foster. And for relationships to be successful, they don't just happen. We have to invest time and emotion in them, so that we make that a priority. Ways to manage our emotions. So the big difficulty is that when we get overwhelmed through change or through now COVID, our autonomic nervous system goes on alert, and often not having impulse control is we do the things that do us harm. So often it's the things that we do to block the pain that do us harm long term. That, and doctors will well know this: alcohol, drugs, any avoidant behavior. Work is an anesthetic. It blocks you from feeling. So that we need to develop ways of how we feel and what our patterns are, that we manage our emotions to have more balance. Our mind and body, that our mind and body are completely interconnected, that what we feel sends a feeling into our body. When we have a feeling, it sends a message up into our brain. And that it's take regular exercise. And in the book, I say JFDI, just fucking do it. Don't fight it. Don't kind of ponce around it. Just basically take exercise very regularly. And if I was only going to do one thing, a combination of 15 minutes exercise and a 5-minute breathing, where you just, there's nothing fancy. You don't have to kind of find nirvana. Breathe in for the count of 7 and out for the count of 11. That will set you up for a better day or a better night's sleep whenever you do it, because it balances it resets your system. That you have limits, learning your no, learning boundaries, and knowing what your limits are.
How do you learn your limits? Do you have your own take on that? Not yours, I mean, but just generally, sort of how you advise people to discover what their limits are.
I think it comes from awareness, really, to know that, I tend to push to do too much because I want to kind of, I people please, and I like being asked to do stuff, so I say yes too often. But I am, now that I'm 60, finally learning that it's better to recognize that if I'm too tired or I'm doing too much, I don't take any pleasure in any of it. So I know what my limits are work-wise. So I know when to stop working and I know when to say no. Or if I'm asked to go out to do something, even if it's a fun thing, I know that it isn't right for me now. So I know what works for me. And I think it's part of knowing yourself.
Is that also a bit about sort of having a longer view of something? Sort of immediate gratification is not necessarily going to give you what in the long run you need.
That short-term hit isn't going to give you the long-term satisfaction.
Yeah.
But also all sorts of limits, about what you eat and drink. The balance is the thing. I mean, it's very hard to do, but it is the thing. And by the way, I'm just looking at a book above your head, which just says "die" on it, which is makes it quite funny.
I'll get rid of that for the next.
Yes. The other thing is structure, which I don't think most doctors need any help with. But basically, when you feel off kilter, you feel kind of lost, and having just even a small structure, not a police state, but a kind of mini structure that you do your work in the morning, you take it, when you do stuff, it kind of balances you, and keeping it in the day. So you keep your focus for today and know what you have to get through today. So during COVID, when I was doing lots of Instagram lives, one of the things was to exercise every day, do a breathing, and just keep it in the day. Don't project into your unknown future. Don't imagine, because your imagination is utterly limitless. So bring your attention to today, and you can cope with anything for a day. Does that make sense?
No, it does. I mean, I'm just so struck by the similarity with in different ways, everybody has sort of spoken about the same things, is sort of bringing a kind of consciousness to your day.
Yeah.
Sort of both are in terms of the mind, body, emotional, physical. And there's something really important about structure that sort of underpins, informs a sense of purpose and sort of well-being.
Yeah.
And, I mean, that's sort of what I'm reminded of as you sort of talk.
Totally. And it's sort of manageable if you have structure. Your day is manageable. Whereas if you wake up and you have no structure, you can really get yourself into a state kind of with whirring imagination, and then you feel hopeless and you feel worse, and you can get into a right hole.
I mean, one of the other things I've sort of been struck by is, we had Tom Mitchell last week. I mean, he talked about the sort of adrenaline rush and hit of being right in the epicenter of sort of a major sort of sports event, but also it just reminds me of just doctors being in constant states of high adrenaline, high levels of stress. So when you talked earlier about suicide, mental health problems, it just seems so sort of obvious that that's what they're going to be struggling, dealing with. I mean, you're sort of talking about stuff to sort of proactively prevent, or certainly make people more stronger, more robust, resilient. If it does begin to fall, if it begins to fall apart, if it's just too much to try and, do you have your own thoughts about what people need to do or how to take care of themselves? You
really need to pay attention and get help.
Mm.
That, white knuckling it and doing more of the same, still doing the same old thing and thinking you're going to get a different result is a route to a nervous breakdown and possible suicide, at the far end of it. So the other thing I really think very strongly is the earlier people have an intervention for themselves when they're feeling stressed or distressed or anxious, or they're not sleeping. Lots of behaviors will give you the signals that something isn't right, that you can't sleep, you eat too much, you drink too much, you can't concentrate. A lot of those things will tell you that, if they pass in a few weeks, that's fine. But if it's continuous, I'd say for more than a month, then you should just take it serious, take yourself seriously, and don't beat yourself up, but actually get proper support. And there's support through you, and there's there is a lot available.
What sort of things?
Well, there's a BMA helpline that people can ring. I don't know whether they do. There's a lot of helplines where people can get support, and of course there's lots of like the UKCP or BACP where they can get a therapist. Occupational health. I don't know what the medics listening, what they think about occupational health. But.
Well, one of the things that that's very good time-wise, because the invitation is for people now to sort of send in questions. In about 10 minutes, Dan will start sort of asking some of the questions that are being messaged in, some of the questions people want to ask you. I'm still curious about the culture, because it just seems so, even if you're emotionally sort of conscious, it just seems by the very nature of the work that it's going to create its own. I mean, just running through it is sort of uncertainty, and uncertainty clearly is a major trigger for stress and anxiety. And by its very nature, it's a world of uncertainty on a constant basis.
And ever changing, new illnesses like now, and it's brutal. It's a brutal system.
Mm.
It's relentless. The hours, the demand, the importance of what they do, and hugely rewarding, and an amazing job to do. I mean, it's the job I admire most of anybody. I mean, I loved being part of a hospital. I still, I'm on the ethics committee at St Mary's now. I'll never leave St Mary's. It's kind of one of the most important aspects of my life, because I love working with medics.
Mm.
I felt proud to be with them. I used to love my lanyard that said I was at St Mary's Hospital, that whole thing of belonging. and being part of something that was bigger and more important than me, I think is very meaningful. And I think it is for doctors. And I think, so there's a lot to be gained from it. But, you know, it's a terrible paradox that the people that go in to a profession to save other people's lives, their lives are more at risk than the national average. And that is not right.
I mean, one of the things that's being talked about is PTSD, that, I mean, there's this view thinking that there's going to be a wave of PTSD. What's your thinking about that?
I think it's extremely likely, because the circumstances of the death, of no family being present, wearing PPE, the numbers of the deaths, the not knowing of the illness, they could have been holding the screen to, you know, a wife or a husband, watching their wife or husband die, and doing an amazing job of mediating it and playing music and doing the best they could. But I mean, that's a massive psychological load of trying to save their life, knowing that you can't save their life, seeing that they're dying, being, you know, being the go-between between the family, telling the family, and the numbers of deaths, the type of deaths, how fast it was, how unknown it was, you know, is all the factors that create PTSD. You know, when you're yeah, that is a definition of what creates PTSD.
And I suppose the things that, I mean, are so central to your book, your sort of philosophy, belief about love and connection, in terms of being able to see people, I mean, their faces, their tone, that's sort of literally masked by PPE equipment, and the lack of any physical contact, that must compound the sort of
Absolutely.
the trauma.
Absolutely. And then the numbers. And, you know, they did an amazing job from what I saw. And, but, I mean, I'd be, you know, WHO has said the next pandemic will be a mental health pandemic globally. So that isn't about doctors in particular, but the impact of the corona for all the different reasons that I'm sure you talked about a lot. So doctors work within that environment. So they're already in an environment that is kind of very distressed within the hospital, and then the outside environment is very distressed. You know, for their families, seeing them go off and risk their own lives when there isn't enough PPE, or risk them anyway because you don't, you know, it's always kind of feels worrying, is incredibly complex, incredibly difficult.
I mean, in general, well, the PTSD, I mean, just to explain what it is to the people listening in. Some people might not actually know what it is.
So first of all, one of the definitions of that, so we can all feel kind of very distressed and have flashing images of a difficult event. So say today I'd seen someone knocked over by a bicycle and I saw the crash happen, I would naturally be very distressed and upset. And it would be normal for me to be distressed and upset and have flashing images of it that I can't control, that constantly get triggered for 6 weeks. But if it goes on for, you know, and there's no exact line in these things, but after 6 weeks, if you still are triggered and you're using all of your psychological kind of force to, because people try and block the image, and then they hear, so it's triggered by sight, sound, touch, or smell, all our senses. Because when you're on alert, your capacity to think goes offline, and your fight or flight or freeze autonomic nervous system goes online. So you're in fourth gear, know what to do, but your thinking is offline. And that's where the trauma comes from, because you're not using your cognitive wisdom and experience and understanding that comes from your prefrontal cortex and from the left side of the brain to make sense of the alarming, frightening thing that you saw. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the work of PTSD, of trauma work, is to take the trauma out of the body through very many different things. So I use EMDR with patients, which connects the maladapted memories to the left side of the brain, where they're then stored naturally in the library. But other people use CBT. There's lots of, there's focusing, there's lots of good methods. But in the meantime, exercising and doing breathing, calming breathing, you want to lower your system. So things that regulate your body help you.
Because, I mean, the theory is, as I understand it, it's not something to attend to in this moment, it's something to attend to when it actually happens. Is that your understanding? Sort of
in this moment.
Well,
you don't know whether you've got PTSD, so you may be traumatized.
Yes.
But it doesn't necessarily become PTSD.
And then not necessarily to talk about that trauma in this particular moment, that it exacerbates or in some way mitigates against something. So
some people say is that in order to get the right side of the brain making sense of it, you need every piece of the puzzle, and it's like there's lots of scraps of paper that are in a dustbin that are sort of jumbled in your brain, and you need to get every piece of that scrap of paper with the words and the feeling and the narrative connected, so that you know the beginning, the middle, and the end of what happened, and you know what your feelings were through them. So before I did EMDR, I used to kind of get people to breathe, and I would get them to recall the memory and then breathe, so that it would go through their system, and then they describe it and talk about it, and then it would the distress would come out of the body, and that's what the work involves.
But that's still doing it several months down the line.
That's doing it later.
And so in this period.
So there's argument. Some people argue that if you're doing it at the time, you're re-triggering it and making it worse.
So if you weren't to do that, because I can imagine if I was going through that, I'd be thinking, well, I've got to wait 3 months, 4 months before I kind of fully go into sort of trauma.
But you can do a lot of the things. You can do a journal, so you can write what you feel. You can do the physical exercise and the breathing. You can talk to people, and so you can try and do behaviors that help calm you down. Yeah.
So that in turn, your thinking is that in turn will sort of mitigate or minimize what's happening further down the road.
Yes. Exactly. I mean, the thing with trauma is that it shapes the brain, and it then influences so much else. I mean, if you look at the sort of war veterans, the rates of alcoholism and addiction, because they're using all these things to try and block the pain of it, the suffering. And then, of course, their relationships don't work and they don't have jobs. And so that it's incredibly important to take it seriously and get the support that you need.
Let's see, Dan, have you got some questions that we can ask Julia?
Yeah, we do. We had, and this is a question that we haven't had a chance to ask before, but it's come up again tonight. And it's essentially regarding the term resilience. A big concern that the term resilience as a concept is used in parts of the NHS to put the onus off staff rather than
staff.
Yeah,
rather than the environment.
Yeah, rather than the environment. Do you think this can be addressed, or another term maybe more useful?
I mean, yes, it's the sort of term of the time, isn't it? I think the environment has to put in place systems that allow resilience, like and speak a language that support it? I mean, you know, it's an enormous question. I don't really have the answers. It was what I battled with all the years at St Mary's, was trying to make it more sort of psychologically minded, and recognizing the importance of staff support from the systems perspective, which then you create, you know, all the research in hospitals shows that where you have trust in teams, you have much less sickness, much less absenteeism, and much less staff turnover.
Well,
So
what was the pushback then against? I mean, I don't mean in sort of, want to particularly sort of narrow down to particular individuals, but just generally, what would be the pushback? Because it just seems so obviously the right thing to do in all sorts of ways.
I think the pushback is really that the demand for doing and achieving and getting patients dealt with, and that whole system is so enormous that it becomes the kind of correlation that isn't a priority.
I mean, just literally can't be included in the picture that's sort of been created.
I mean, that is I mean, I don't know what other people think. That is the culture that I saw, is that the pressure to get through their day just from a kind of medical perspective doesn't allow time for debriefing, doesn't allow time and space for psychological support.
And so the way that you do the sort of small victories or significant sort of changes, how did you make that then happen? Was it just a constant sort of?
Yes. So I brought in the debriefing, and eventually it became a habit that they did it, and it came. But you know, it took years. It took years. It took years to get asking a question about communicating to families when a child dies on the exam. So when I went and lectured for years, like 15 years, no one paid any attention because it wasn't going to be examined. So I had to push, and they were very open to it. So once it became an exam question, they paid more attention. So, you know, it's a complicated whole business. Dan, I don't know what you think about how, I mean, you'd know far more than I would how to change hospitals' culture.
Have you've just asked to bring Dan in? Yes.
Do you have an answer?
I think, you know, I think the importance of debriefing is a crucial one, and I think what you're saying is exactly right. But it's also finding the time in the day to debrief, and sometimes I think a team can be put together that day, and then they do all these intense things together, whether that's being on the crash team or whatever, and they don't have time to debrief. It's just, you know, the nature of it. It's kind of the way that you know, the way I see it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is exactly what happens, and that's what you're kind of fighting against. But I mean, is there an answer for that?
I think.
Well, you okay, Doc?
Yes, I think everything helps, isn't it? Influencing, changing, shaping, increasing people's understanding.
Yeah, I think it's just developing that awareness, and what Chris always says is kind of normalizing everything that we're talking about, and it's just gradually shifting that culture. I mean, that's the way that I see it. But I feel like I should leave you guys to it and continue.
Well, actually, it's quite good for you to come in on the stand so people get to know you.
Okay.
I mean, because you're the founder of You OK Doc. I mean, what was it that you sort of saw that kind of said, this is what I want to do? There's something here that needs to be sort of addressed.
I think, you know, it all stems. So the charity was conceived, as you know, Chris, as an idea in 2018, and actually a lot has changed in the last year and a half, or it is changing. I've definitely seen the landscape change a bit, especially during COVID as well, with the support services. You know, obviously I have my personal reasons. I've had a family member who was a doctor that took their own life, and so those obviously are contributing factors. but overall, I thought there was a real space for independent charity, and I really kind of what really resonated with me was the British Medical Association. They published some literature that essentially identified that actually doctors, weren't that comfortable going to in-house wellness services. I mean, that's a very
health.
Yeah, and that actually the space away from the hospitals may be quite beneficial. To go into a bit further, like I've seen Chris on a personal level, and Chris wasn't working in the NHS, so I definitely that definitely resonated with me, and so that's where the idea came from. And I thought, let's not offer that on a wider scale.
Good idea.
Yeah.
Another question?
Yeah, we have a few questions. One of the questions was, what advice would you give doctors potentially facing a second wave to prepare themselves for dealing with the volume of inevitable deaths and traumas that may occur?
Well, the first thing would be that the accumulative kind of build-up, if the doctors haven't dealt with the cases and the sort of residing trauma from the cases in March and April, they will be re-triggered by the cases in October, November, or if there is whenever the second spike may be. And so that I think your first most crucial step is really to address that now in the months in between and get the support that you need so that you kind of feel more robust and quite clear that it isn't kind of occupying you, because the body remembers, the body holds the score. It's wired to remember, so that if you see that corner where the tiger was, that you always associate that corner with the tiger. And in the same way, your body will remember faster than your brain will think of all the sights, the sounds, the smells of being in an intensive care unit in your PPE. So it will bring back, without you choosing, that previous experience. So the more that you've done to kind of sift that out of your system, then the more robust you'll be. But also I would talk to your teams about what psychological support you need if there is a crisis, and maybe get one set up. I mean, I don't know how many hospitals had what I did. I don't know how, we had very good occupational health at St Mary's too. So St Mary's was extremely good. They had in-house help, and then I did this sort of Zoom support. So they were very good, but I wonder through the UK what the level of support for the whole teams were.
I mean, it's going to vary from trust hospitals.
Big time.
But you're at core, you're saying find ways to sort of process, talk about what you've gone through in whatever way you can do that, whether it's in-house.
And also make sure you have a break, have a holiday between now and then, so that you have more energy. I mean, everyone must be so worn out.
I mean, they don't have structured, literally like a war zone, taking people out for a period of R&R and then putting them back in again.
No. I don't understand Schwartz rounds that well. I mean, the person who asked the question, but there was someone I work with at St Mary's who does them, and they apparently are incredibly powerful and very helpful. But I don't know enough about them to be able to describe them, so I shouldn't really talk about it. But if those are interested, note them down, and they're more and more common in hospital trusts.
Sorry, I missed it, Julia.
They're called Schwartz rounds. Dan, I don't know if you know about Schwartz rounds.
No, I don't. Do you know? No, I don't actually. No.
Well, maybe I can post something on your thing, and so I can be a bit more useful than just saying the name.
But it's a form of it's a way of communicating.
Form of team support.
Right.
Someone comes in and they talk about their experience, and then I don't actually know. Let's not stop talking about it. But it's worth finding out.
No, it's definitely worth finding out. I mean, in some ways, I mean, Dan's very knowledgeable. The fact that it's sort of not immediately known about, it's you know, I suppose it's proof that, I mean, it's part of these conversations is to keep pushing the agenda and
opening up ideas and things.
Well, educating people, informing people, having a debate, and my favorite is sort of, well, two things, both normalizing and getting ahead of the curve. I mean, I think UAK doc was, you know, the obvious sort of services or provisions were people who were already struggling, suffering hugely. But I think the more this has sort of developed, it's proactive, preemptive sort of work that isn't just about surviving and dealing with something, but it's actually making it more, it's clearly such a fulfilling role for people, but actually beginning to eliminate some of the things that aren't really necessary. I mean, I think there's a reality to what doctors and medical practitioners have to face, but something about just the versions of what they can experience going through a job they love. Dan, do you have another question?
Yeah, we have a few. So, and I know this has been actually spoken about amongst my doctor colleagues. It's a question regarding the process of telling a patient or their relative, sorry, through the phone, you know, that this is their last phone call, etc., or you know, their loved one's not doing well and they don't have the ability to come in. Is there anything that you would suggest in that situation? Obviously, this is quite a unique situation for doctors to be in.
Horrendous. I think if they can prepare themselves a bit, and this sounds a bit too cliched and therapy-ish, but I would literally take 5 breaths, like breathe in for 5, hold for 5, breathe out for 5, hold for 5. Just do, say, 5 or 10 breaths so that you slow your kind of beating heart down. Because if you slow down, your emotional connection is much broader, and they will feel you much more empathically and compassionately. And I mean, you know, breaking bad news, the things I always taught, and I think it would be true for this, is always ask what they've understood, how sick they're. So I know it sounds sort of bonkers on the phone, but I just want to check what is your understanding of your husband, your wife, your child, whatever it is, your grandfather's, how sick his illness is, how bad, what do you understand? And they will then say to you, I think he's dying, or is he going to die? And then you can respond with the facts. Yes, you're right. He, you know, his stats are very bad now. It looks like we haven't got very long, that he is going to die over the next whatever it is. And then let them sort of take that in. The big thing of breaking bad news is going slowly and giving them time to ask you 1 or 2 questions. I mean, you probably don't have, I don't know how much time you have to do it, because the thing I would think is that the person looking after the patient shouldn't be the one breaking the news. So you should be able to sort of step aside and be in the room so they can see their partner, whoever it is, and then ask them what they need. What do they want? What would they like you to do? Would you like them to play a piece of music? Would you like them to hold their hand? Would you like them to take photographs? Because the task of mourning is facing the reality of the death. And I've worked now with quite a few people whose parents have died or grandparents from COVID. And it's surreal because they didn't go in, they never saw them, and they never saw them dead. And so they need images to enable them to face that reality, to know in a way they can't not know that person they love has died. But that's probably too much information.
No, I think it's amazing.
I hope that answers the question.
No, I think it's amazing what you're sharing and sort of giving us insight and knowledge about, Julia. I mean, I'll get another question in a minute, but I mean, we've been talking for an hour, and there's just so much that you've been sharing with us that's actually full of emotion. It's very sort of...
The thing, thank you. I interrupted you, I'm really sorry. The thing that matters to families most is that they feel that you care about their person, the person that they love. And so when they imagine, it's terrible imagining the person you love kind of being in a hospital surrounded by people in astronaut outfits. But if they feel that he was a really nice doctor, I knew he really looked after my dad, I knew he was really kind to him, it's that really matters. That's what will enable them to manage the death without being traumatized.
Do you think on the whole, the response, I mean, in the midst of ferocious grief and distress, do you think on the whole that if you do that, the response is primarily what you've just described?
People
I can imagine that, I mean, I can sort of imagine.
Grateful. I was so grateful to that doctor. He was amazing.
Mm.
Because the doctor may well, I mean, I knew it with the nurses. The nurses built up quite a relationship with a lot of the families because they were their communicators in a way that you wouldn't necessarily do on a normal intensive care.
I mean, I'm sort of aware of, I mean, I agree absolutely with what you're suggesting, inviting people to sort of engage with, and it opens you up to a much more emotional experience as well, and how you hold that, because you're inviting a sort of emotional intimacy, a sort of connection with them.
I think the thing that counters that is that if you feel that you've done a really good job, and it's a professional part of your job, communicating,
yeah,
that repairs the trauma of it, because you really feel that you did the best that you could in a really devastating circumstances.
I think that's a really, it's sort of still a role. There's still a role that you're...
I think you have many more regrets. I think you have many more regrets as a doctor if you feel like, oh, I just know I didn't do that right. And then you wheel and go ruminate and go over and over in your mind, like, oh my goodness, I said that, I used that word, I was too quick, all those regrets. So for both, so one of the things I talk about with doctors and patients is two things. One is that regrets are the kind of fault line that really damage both people. So if your family feels regrets that they didn't see that the person that died, they didn't say goodbye, they didn't hold them, all of those regrets can derail the grieving. And for a doctor, they can regret that they didn't feel like they did a good enough job. And the big thing I always teach doctors, don't conflate doing something that's difficult and bad, that you are bad. So you have to separate out that you're doing something that is really difficult, and you may feel bad, but it doesn't mean that you're bad. You have to kind of know that there's a real difference. But also that you talk to each other as expert to expert. I mean, this is a bit too probably not right for COVID, but there's the patient who's the expert on themselves and their family, and you're the expert on the illness and the diagnosis and the prognosis, and you communicate expert to expert, so that both of you have a valid and equal position. And by the time you've had these incredibly complicated discussions about, say, turning off the life support machine, that you both feel that you've had a kind of voice. But that doesn't mean that the doctor doesn't overall have have power. I think sometimes they hand power with the information too much to the families and ask them to make the decision. I think the doctor has to take the responsibility of the decision with them.
Just because of time, let's try and, Dan, can we squeeze in a few more questions?
Yeah, there's another question. Do you think people will grieve differently following the pandemic?
Well, I think there'll be more trauma because they weren't present. They didn't have the opportunity to say goodbye. They didn't have people coming in and supporting them, bringing lasagna and hugs and love. And because that's what makes a difference when you're grieving, is the love and connection to others. They didn't have a proper ending with a funeral. You know, they have maximum 5 or 10 people socially distanced. So all the rituals that enable us to kind of weather the not knowing and the sort of huge amount of loss from death have been taken off the table. I mean, I think this is a sort of perverse consequence. I think we talk more about death now, and from my perspective, that's a good thing, because I think the more we talk about death and recognize our mortality and talk to each other about what we want, how we want to be buried, what we fear, what we think about death, then I think there's less regrets for the people who survive us. So I think it's an important part of life. So I think there have been more conversations. But yeah, I think there'll be much more complex grief as a result. It's very likely.
Can we get one more in, Dan?
Yeah, this is a question from one of the doctors, and he says that he knows many doctors that go over, ruminate over kind of things that they've done. How would you advise to stop that process or to lessen that?
There are a number of things. Journaling really helps. Writing it down. Write the story, what happened from the beginning, the middle, and the end. Don't mind about how you write it. Just get it out on a paper, on a piece of paper. I think writing physically on paper is more cathartic than in a typewriter, because I think the physicality of actually writing it, you feel more like you're getting it out.
And it's literally outside of yourself.
It's literally outside of yourself, and I think on a laptop it just doesn't have the same impact. And it's your own signature, it's your own work, you know, it's your writing. So it's personalized, it makes it more real. I think peer support, like even going to have a pint or a coffee or whatever with a colleague and spending 20 minutes each talking about what's been difficult, one person listening, the other one talking. I think that really helps, that thing of recognizing that you're not the only one that thinks about this. And I think the other thing is to do intentional things that calm you down. So, you know, when I feel like I've made mistakes and stuff, I buy myself flowers. I know that sounds a bit twee, but I do. And it's sort of like self-compassionate. I just give myself something. The flowers are on the table. It's not saying, well done you. It's saying, you know, it's a kind of forgiving. We're human. We make mistakes. You know, I've said
it's an act of kindness to yourself.
It's an act of kindness to yourself. That's a good way of putting it.
I mean, it again, just brings me back to just everything that's sort of important is a sort of conscious sort of engagement with all the different sort of edges, threads of all of these things, and keeping focused on that as a process, sort of structure to your day that includes a series of things that are about self-care and
taking it seriously.
Yeah, really taking it seriously.
Just one more thing with ruminating. I think the feelings aren't facts is an important part of that. That your facts feel bad, make you bad.
Yeah.
I think that's a useful thing to chuck into your kind of cognition to talk to yourself.
So say it again, Julia, because I read that in the book.
Feelings are not facts. The fact that you feel bad doesn't mean that you are bad.
Yeah.
So recognize, and doctors, when bad things happen, often feel bad. And so to recognize that isn't necessarily the case, and kind of separate their head and their heart, let their logical brain, you know, you can't put logic through an emotional system.
Yes.
But if once you've done the narrative, you've written it down, you've done some kind of exercise to calm yourself down, you've given yourself a treat, then you can say to yourself, you know, I feel like this, and kind of talk to your partner or a friend or whatever, but I know in my head this, and you can hold them both. They don't knock each other out, but allow them both. And that does help settle, because the ruminating is looking for an answer or looking to fix it. And doctors always want to fix stuff. So they're always wanting to fix their questions. And many of the things that are bothering them don't have answers.
Yes.
And so recognizing the limits of their power is a very important thing.
I mean, it's sort of that human need to have a binary sort of conclusion. Because I often think that if, you know, what you're just saying about fact and emotions, they're not the same. If you strip it of that, you're still left with very painful feelings.
Yeah, but then do what you can to kind of support yourself and allow them.
Yeah, and that brings you back to sort of emotional consciousness of care and kindness to yourself.
And if you express a feeling, it has a kind of cycle and it goes. It lands on it is a process.
Yes.
Kind of releases you. It's when you block the feelings that they stay alive and keep kind of torturing you.
Can we squeeze in one more question, Julia, before I have to let you go?
Yeah.
So we have a question regarding the NHS. If there was, so this person said that, you know, different hospitals have different processes in place to support their staff. What would you recommend as a uniform way of supporting their staff?
Well, it's like I said before, I think one of it would be that early in your training that you put in place kind of that you have, you know, that you have to support yourself, and that you have a kind of psychological understanding of the impact of the work that you're doing, so that you don't feel like you're bad because you're not coping. I think occupational health, I don't know why occupational health is stigmatized, but I wish occupational health could be used more effectively as a kind of real resource that the doctors could use. I think the big thing is that the leadership has to role model the importance of psychological health. So they role model it by owning what they feel, they model it by getting support for themselves, they model it by, you know, being empathic and compassionate to their teams. And then that does change, it changes a team and it changes a culture when that becomes the norm from the top. It's much harder from the bottom, but I'm hoping all the younger doctors are going to be the doctors of the future that will change it too.
I mean, it's certainly something that we're wanting to sort of pay attention to is the new wave, the students, the younger generations, that I think are also just coming from a much more, just their culture, their sort of peers, groups are much more geared towards talking about emotions and
they're
feelings.
much more emotionally aware, yeah.
And it's certainly something we want to sort of tap into and build upon, because this is going to take time to sort of push back against the culture, but also to evolve it, to develop it, really.
I mean, I think my answer isn't a very good one. I mean, I think it's such a complex problem. I wish I had an answer. Because the actual demand of the work is so enormous that people's mental health becomes secondary in the fight to save someone's life. You know, it's an incredibly complicated thing. No,
I mean, I think that's so clear, and at the same time,
it's vital that they do.
Yeah,
they'll be fine.
And it's quite clear that there are, you know, that everyone who that I've spoken to over the last 4 weeks, sort of said in different ways, but essentially the same thing, which is the important ways of taking care of yourself emotionally and mentally.
And take responsibility for it, like do it. JFDI. Responsibility.
So there's a difference between, I'm going to have to let you go in a minute. There's a difference between response, because some people would confuse that with looking at their own behavior through a critical lens, presumably. They would feel that that was taking responsibility, do you think?
What I meant was I shouldn't have said responsibility, take it seriously for yourself. Given that you're in a culture that is a brutal culture, really, it's a very, very demanding culture. And I would want, like we said, I'd want it to change so that the two worked in alignment between their teams that they employed and themselves. But given that isn't the situation right now, I would want people to take seriously the importance of their wellness and the things that they choose to do that regularly. There's no point doing it just for sort of 3 months a year. When I teach doctors, I often go around a room and I say, if I asked you out of 10, if you had needed to help someone else, how reliable would you be? And most people go 10, 9. Then I ask them, if I'm asking you to be reliable and supportive of yourself, what would you give yourself? And they go 2. So we need to they need individually to up that number, that you're giving as much, not as much, but you're giving yourself enough and ongoing habits, behaviors, ways of being, attitudes, ways of thinking that support you to do your job and don't self-harm.
I mean, I think possibly one of the ways to bring the two together is just to see how it benefits your work as a doctor.
Yeah, I mean, it would save the NHS money in the long term, with all the lack of absenteeism, staff turnover, more effective working. But it's a bit like an election; they always want the short-term wins, right?
Yes, but doctors, I mean, not to put even more pressure on them, but being at the sort of edge of human interaction, literally life and death, that they can also be kind of role models. They can sort of articulate, sort of show, lead the way in terms of how to engage with things on an emotional level. For us as a sort of population, as patients, as clients.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a very good point.
Julia, thank you so much for coming on and speaking to me. It's been such a pleasure having you, genuinely. You've got so much insight and wisdom to share. I think people will be actually, it's been quite moving listening to the things you've been talking about. We're talking about such powerful things, and we've talked about it calmly and sort of kind of consciously, but it's so full of emotion, the things you've been talking about. And I think you are holding it in the way that you do is just so valuable, and sort of a role model really for how to attend to ourselves in the way that you've described. So thank you so much.
Absolutely, my pleasure. And I hope it's been helpful, and I hope if one person just takes one thing from it, that it will make a difference. So, and lovely to see you, Chris. Nice to meet you, Dan, and good luck with this amazing new charity. And you're doing really important work, so I wish you the very best with it, and may it fly and change the health of doctors and health professionals.
Yes, thank you very much. Just a quick note to say, next week we've got Adam Kay, who wrote the book This Too I think you wrote the book This Too Shall Hurt. Is that what you wrote, Julia? Dan?
He wrote This Is Going to Hurt.
This Is Going to Hurt. Yeah. So I'm very brief.
And he sold 5 million copies.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Julia.